throughout this process, there have been a number of ideas, a number of strategies over the decades that have been designed to deal with, of course, one of the big issues in Northern Ireland, which is the fact that most people still go to separate schools. I'm conscious of the dialogue, the discussion between the terms separate and segregated, and I put it out there because it's still an issue and a sensitivity for some people. I'm using the terminology of separation, but whether we call it separate or segregated, the purpose of those who've been working at these kinds of activities has been to try to offset the worst effects of that and to promote reconciliation. And that's a key word. A lot of us use it, I'm quite sure, and it's one that we will come to again a little bit later. So the kind of activities under various names, contact initiatives, integrated education, curriculum initiatives, school collaborations, that maybe is very similar to contact, but it's a term that's used on its own sometimes. And of course, currently, shared education is the terminology that a lot of people are using, a lot of people are involved in. And the theme is persistent. How do we mitigate that separateness, not just in schools, but the separateness that infiltrates so much of society still, despite all the progress that has undoubtedly been made. So again, just a sort of a sample of some of the things that have been there on the journey, and there are many more. One of the key things has been the belief in the importance of contact, that if people are unable to relate to each other or don't know each other or live separately, that one of the ways that you can help develop their understanding is to get them to be together. And that's underpinned so much work. I mean, virtually all of the strategies that I listed on the previous slide. And I mean, we could talk academically about the contact hypothesis, but I like this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. I first read about him when I first came to Corrymeela, and that was rather a revelation to me. But it sums it up, really. People fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they've not communicated with each other. Whatever about academic definitions, of which there are many, that seems to me to sum up the whole concept. And of course, it's not just related to Northern Ireland or our situation. Are separate schools the cause, or a cause, or just a symptom of the conflict, or indeed, is it both? The key questions about how we deal with this are could be summed up by being threefold. How should we deal with it? Do we just go along with the status quo? Some people would say, well, at least we're safer that way. We're not taking risks. We go on with our own parallel communities, and yes, it's a sort of a benign apartheid, a benign separation, but it keeps things secure. Some people would still say that. Others say, well, we've got to work together more. We've got to maybe somehow find a way across those divides, but still, some people would say, keep the structures as we have them. Again, it's safe, it's secure, people learn about themselves, their own identity. So we collaborate, we work together, we work at good relations, but we keep things as they are. And of course, others say, no, we've got to change those structures. If we can't do it now, we must do it as soon as possible. So the integrated movement argues for one system for all pupils. Those seem to me to sum up the options. There may be other things you want to add to that. It seems to me there are complicating factors that we're well aware of. One, of course, is that our demographics, our housing, also reflect a separateness. And sometimes, whichever of these you're trying to do, the fact that children are living in different areas is a real difficulty. It's a real problem. For setting up an integrated school that is going to be balanced, or for being able to travel far enough to find a school of the other sort. So the separateness is not just in schools. There are still anxieties in the community. We still have a lot of peace wars, and as I'm sure people here are well aware, there are more of them now than there were 20 years ago at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. There are the fears of loss of identity. Is this work just trying to assimilate people into a grey mass where everybody is the same, but they lose their cultural, religious, political sense of identity? And then, of course, and it's a big one, and I don't know how much we'll talk about that today, but on top of all of this, you've got the academic selection and the tends also to reflect, at least to some degree, a social division. So, all of these are factors, and some of these complicate the way we give these answers and these responses. We're probably all aware of the history of attempts by governments in the 19th century and the early 20th century to have a schooling that was for everybody, with provision for separate religious instruction and so forth. We're aware of that, and we're aware, generally speaking, that those initiatives failed. Some of them quickly, some of them over time. And so that separateness really is continuing until very much the outbreak of yet another and more significant time of conflict alerts people to, here are those issues again. We may have sort of set them to one side, but here they're emerging once again. I don't know how many people here are familiar with the work of John Malone. I'm very conscious when I speak to an audience like this, there will be some people who know lots of the things, and I'll be just repeating things that a lot of people know. There's some people know everything and a lot more too. But the work of John Malone has tended to be a little bit forgotten. If Derek Wilson was here, and I think he will be here later on, Derek would tell you a lot more about the work of John Malone, because he was one of John Malone's young professionals working with his project, which started in 1970, when John, who had been the principal of Orangefield High School in East Belfast, and a highly respected school principal, very involved in things like international perspectives as well, he was asked by the Ministry of Education, as it was then, and by, I think it was the Head Teachers Association or a similar body, if he would lead this project on community relations. They did a lot of work. Avila Kilmurray has referred to it as an early vision, and I think it really, really was. John Malone organised some processes in contact. He looked at the curriculum, he developed ideas, he borrowed ideas from elsewhere, and suddenly in 1972, not long after Stormont was prorogued and the direct rule government came in, he was called in, and a government minister, a Westminster minister, tore a few strips off him and told him that he was going too far. And his publications were stopped, and he wrote, towards the end of that year, he wrote a report which you can see the disappointment. But one of the really positive things that he wrote, and in a sense, in this sense, he was a true prophet. What is required, he wrote, is a wholesale reassessment of aims and objectives and relative priorities, not within the schools alone, but within the whole education system, in the light of the needs of this community and the children who are growing up in it. I think it was quite a long time before that was widely recognised. I thought it might be useful. Maurice Hayes, some of you will remember Maurice Hayes, a Catholic civil servant when there weren't too many Catholic civil servants, but a senior civil servant. He died just a year or two ago. Maurice Hayes, in his autobiography, mentions John Malone and John's work, and he says, this is a direct quote, "His pioneering work was disgracefully ignored by the sceptical and non-practicing pundits in the Ministry of Education." hope nobody's offended by that, but Maurice Ryan, in a sense, Maurice Hayes was one of them. You know, he was one of those civil servants, but not one in the Ministry of Education. He was in other departments. So it's interesting. I think we need maybe to remember the pioneering work of John Malone, and sadly he died about 10 years after this, when some of the initiatives were just beginning to take place with Department of Education interventions. Other things were going on. Professor Malcolm Skilbeck, who was Professor of Education at the NUU as it was then, he made this remark that shocked a few people. I wasn't there, but I know people who were there, and he made this statement that teachers are naive bearers of sectarian culture. When that was published about 3 years later, the word sectarian had been very carefully taken out, but there are people who will affirm that that was the term he used. What was he saying? Was he saying teachers are sectarian? I don't think he was. I think he was saying that if we don't actually do something, if we don't intervene, then we're allowing sectarianism to filter in to what we do. Skilbeck's work was very much led to the development of the school's cultural studies project, which went on under different leadership after he left. From the mid-70s, certainly to the late 80s, some schools maybe longer than that, but not a vast number of schools. At post-primary level, it seems to me, looking at it again now, that it was a sort of early citizenship education type program. At the same time, Dr. John Greer, the Reverend Dr. John Greer, who I see as a sort of a personal mentor in many ways, also at Coleraine, developed, along with a colleague who was the Catholic chaplain at UU, the Religion in Ireland program. John was a Church of Ireland minister and also an academic. Their work lasted many years. It wasn't published until 1985, but what he was trying to do was to say Catholics and Protestants should learn about each other's religions, about their beliefs and their practices, and that was not widely accepted as a possibility in those days. And there are many teachers, perhaps of my generation of teachers teaching RE, who would again look back on John Greer's work in that sort of, with that respect and admiration. There are other NGOs and the universities, including Queen's, including Stranmillis and St Mary's, were setting up various experiments in curriculum, in contact, in areas such as history, religious education, social studies, and others. And there was quite a lot of work done in the 70s, maybe in small pockets, but people were trying, usually without any sort of government support, to make some kind of impact. And of course it was the early 70s when All Children Together that became the sort of the group that led to the establishment of integrated schools, started to campaign, a parents' campaign, working over a number of years of disappointment, of frustration, and eventually coming to fruition in the very early 1980s. Education for international understanding was also a factor. There's something about people who've had experience outside and come back that I think has always enriched us, have been very important. CEWC, Council for Education and World Citizenship, a number of people in the early days had been involved in that. So the broader perspective is really important. A report that was published, these are really two reports that were published together later, but Schools Apart, the research work was that mainly of Dominic Murray, reported in 1977, again at Coleraine, the Centre for the Study of Conflict, which has been another significant player in this work at one stage. And then a few years later, the Schools Together report. And again, looking at people's practices, their awareness of each other. I don't know how easy it is. I still have a copy of that. I don't know whether maybe somebody, maybe it's already on the cane website, but somebody maybe should take a look back at that and see what it shows about where we've come from. The 1980s brought new initiatives. Peace education was quite a big thing globally, very controversial in England, and a peace education program was established by the churches in the late 70s and then into the 1980s. It gave me my first option of moving out of the classroom and doing work of this kind on a full-time basis. The first integrated school opened in 1981. It became Lagan College, but it started in a scout hut. Famously, I'm sure you all know this story, 28 pupils, no desks, I think that's the title of a recent book, and no government funding for another 3 years. So the parents were funding this themselves. But now it's the most oversubscribed school in Northern Ireland. The Department of Education came into the act. I think there were various political reasons why they did this. Some of the people involved in the department in the early 1980s were very passionately committed to this. This circular, which used to be very famous, maybe not so much now, was actually sent, unusually for school circulars, to every teacher. In fact, I gather there had been a discussion in the Department of Education as to whether it should be put into teachers' pay packets, and somebody decided that might just be a bit too heavy. But every teacher, every school manager, board member and trustee, etc., has a responsibility for helping children to learn to understand and respect each other, their different culture, different customs and traditions. Every teacher was at least supposed to get a copy of that. And I remember the vice principal in the school where I was teaching leaving it on my desk one day, but I know a lot of teachers who have no memory of that. 1980s developed more NGOs and the secondment of teachers. So I had my opportunity to be seconded to the Church's Peace Education Programme. At the same time, Corrymeela appointed Carmel Heaney as their first schools worker. Chris was established and had a teacher who was seconded, and so on and so forth. There were teaching professionals who were now doing this broader professional job. The NICED Emu Steering Committee, there's a sort of an image in my mind about emu steering that is too literal, but the group that really first brought in that term, education for mutual understanding, based actually on people talking about education for international understanding. And the NICED committee continued to develop through the 1980s, developed documentation, ideas. It was completely voluntary then, but trying to get schools to think other things we can do here. They appointed field officers and so forth. And that work really continued right up to education reform time. And then the committee was stood down, I think rather unfortunately, by Dr. Brian Mawhinney, who was the Minister of Education at the time. He had also established a cross-community contact scheme, which lasted in one form or another until just 9 years ago. And of course, throughout that time, integrated schools, from about 1985 especially, integrated schools were beginning to develop more and more, primary, post-primary, and so forth, steadily over the next years. Funding became available significantly. Research was going on. The Centre for the Study of Conflict that I mentioned, the UNESCO Centre that Alan is still involved with, and so forth. And teachers were getting drawn in. I was going around schools at that time sort of saying, here are some resources, do you think you could use them, or words to that effect. And some schools were looking at me thinking, yes, maybe. Not really knowing where it fitted in. And there were some who said, oh, this isn't really my job. This is not for us. So a mixture of enthusiasm, uncertainty, indifference. Into the 1990s, again, as I said, this is very selective and very rushed. the educational cross-curricular themes, including education for mutual understanding and cultural heritage. They were supposed to be everybody's responsibility, and of course the danger, much repeated, was that they often became in a school everybody else's responsibility. Rather than something that I have to do. But some teachers did grasp very enthusiastically that work and took it forward, and some very good developments. EMU and cultural heritage, and EMU especially, was supposed to be a curriculum initiative. Teachers were supposed to look at what they could do in their own subject, their own class, and so forth. It very quickly became a synonym, falsely, for cross-community contact. So people, when they said, I'm doing EMU, what they meant was they were involved in the cross-community contact scheme. And you still hear teachers using that terminology today, and that's still very often the perception. And I know I've said it many times to groups of students and groups of teachers, but it's one of those things that never just seems to quite get across to many people who've used the term that way for so long. One of the issues at the time was, should contact be made statutory, be made compulsory? The group that developed the documentation for EMU did consider that very seriously. One of them told me that there was blood on the floor when that was discussed. The decision was, no, we won't make it compulsory, but we'll strongly encourage it, which is what they did. And maybe that was right, especially at the time. But there were many critiques. There were newspapers and others sort of saying this is just very superficial. Groups are going in parallel, they're not really meeting each other, they're just going to the same place. They may be using the funding very nicely, but they're not doing anything significant. They're avoiding the difficult issues. They're not really talking to each other. And of course that wasn't true of all of them by any means, but it did become something of a stereotype for that work. The contact scheme was changed in 1996. It became the school's community relations program with the intention that it would emphasize more community relations rather than just be perhaps a social gathering. Again, someone involved from right through the 1990s in various forms of teacher development. It was very limited. There were people came to courses, and some of them have continued and have gone on to this day, but others had no opportunities. It was always limited, and that, I think, has been an issue right throughout. Into the noughties, of course, the Good Friday Agreement makes a statement about an essential aspect of the reconciliation process being the promotion of a culture of tolerance at every level of society. A lot of people have said, wish they'd used the word respect, but that's what they used. It was a very last-minute clause added in, I'm told. Including initiatives to facilitate and encourage integrated education and mixed housing. And if you look at the Northern Ireland Act that came out of that agreement, integrated education becomes a responsibility of the government to promote and encourage. The reviews of contact programs, as I've indicated, were variable. A very good one came from UU. I think it was from the UNESCO Centre, Alan, back in the early noughties, saying that yes, there was some good work, but on the whole, the weaknesses tended to overwhelm the strengths. The models of citizenship education, seen as a much more substantive thing, also were coming from really the mid-90s onwards, and particularly into the early 2000s. And eventually we got local and global citizenship, which I suspect for some has been perceived as a little bit watered down from where we might have been, and maybe a disappointment. Again, I'd be interested to hear what your experience is on that. The revised curriculum replaced the educational theme, so EMU no longer exists from this, or very close to this point onwards, with areas of learning, personal development and mutual understanding, learning for life and work. Speaking as someone in Stranmillis who's been teaching personal development and mutual understanding, PDMU, for many years now, that has been an opportunity to do things with students that were very difficult to do because they didn't fit anywhere else until this was something that every teacher, every primary teacher had to take seriously. I'm not sure how well, and it's partly because I don't do it, I'm not sure how effectively learning for life and work, which includes personal development, includes local and global citizenship, I'm not sure how well that's done, but I suspect that it is done very well in some places, and it's my lack of experience of that maybe is a factor. Shared education, the terminology comes in. Queen's Starter Project, and models in various places, and schools are drawn into what is really a slightly different form of a contact program. The Schools Community Relations program funding was cancelled in 2010. A lot of people were very disappointed. Some good work, and there was some good work, stopped or found itself much harder, especially if your linked school was a distance away, which so many are from that point onwards. Some really tried nobly to carry it on, but the funding was very limited. And then the CRED policy. I'll say a little bit more about this later. Community Relations, Equality and Diversity in 2011 renewed a commitment to community relations, but also made the point that NGO bodies, voluntary bodies, were no longer really part of what they perceived to be the scene. And that's maybe one of the issues we should talk about later. Then, of course, Peter Robinson makes his famous statement in 2010, so shared education becomes much more focused, leading us up to the present day. And various policies, various reviews of the situation leading up to the Shared Education Act, just over 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I suppose, and the Shared Education Project and training programs and so forth. So a lot of the things that hadn't been done prior because there wasn't the funding, there wasn't the opportunity, have certainly been done more so during this project. The commitment also, of course, is to shared campuses. That's been a slower process than I think people expected. OMA is online for, isn't it, 5 schools in the one campus, which I gather is causing major issues. Six schools. Major issues around road changes in OMA, but that's maybe a different discussion. Shared education has its biannual review. The first one came out last May, I think it was, indicating that there, yes, had been some good progress, but also some gaps and weaknesses, particularly at the post-primary level. Number of schools involved, quite high. Number of pupils involved, relatively low by comparison. So issues there. And of course, all the time, throughout this, the integrated movement has been working, developing new schools. We're now at 65, is it, Rasheen? Yeah, and Jill. But is the government still committed? It's supposed to be. Is it committed as it was? Has all the emphasis come on shared education? That's one of the issues that I think we need to be very honest and open with each other about. What is the relationship there? Shared education is defined by Paul Connolly's little working group as the core mechanism for improving schools, increasing educational outcomes for all children and young people, and preparing them to play a full and active role in building and sustaining an open, inclusive, and confident society. The word reconciliation isn't mentioned there. I can't remember if it's mentioned in the Connolly report, but it is referred to in other contexts. The Shared Education Act says that the purposes are to deliver educational benefits to children and young persons, promote the efficient and effective use of resources, promote equality of opportunity, promote good relations, and to promote respect for identity, diversity, and community cohesion. And certainly the last two, if not the last 3 points there, could be seen to bear some significant relationship to this word that we use, reconciliation. So these are my last few thoughts, and these are really the themes and the issues, which I think are open for you to give your view. The question of whether we go for integration or collaboration or sharing or whatever we call it continues to be a sensitive one. and some people feel very, very concerned that we're not doing the right thing there. The question is, or a question is, can we develop both effectively? Are we right to try to do both in parallel, or are they ultimately mutually exclusive? I throw that one over to you. Is there a limit to the potential effectiveness of contact if schools actually remain separate? There are many people would argue that it is. Others say, no, you can overcome that. Has shared education, in fact, been a blocker for integrated education? So I know these are controversial, sensitive issues, but I put them out there because I do think a body like this, a group like this, needs to talk about these things and be open with each other about them. The NGO support role was ended by CRED, as I said earlier, who said that schools didn't need that anymore. Teachers would take this work on. Many teachers are unhappy about that. As a result, several of the NGOs have disappeared. Some of you know more about that than I do. Lack of funding, loss of, I think particularly loss of significant long-term expertise that really worries me within the system. People who've had to go back to do something else because there wasn't the possibility for them. Others have continued but have struggled. And I know certainly from Chris, from Corrymeela and from other bodies that there's always a question of where is the next funding going to come from. Bodies that do, in my view, brilliant work struggling to be there and very much valued by teachers. It seems to me that the best work by bodies like that supports teachers, encourages teachers and empowers teachers. And yes, I'm sure there has been less good work where bodies have done it for the teachers. That's not been my experience of the bodies that I know. So can we continue to sustain the role of the NGOs in partnership with other agencies? It always has to be, in my view, a partnership. I said this is my perspective. This is where, in many ways, I'm coming from. One of the other issues is how do we deal with controversial issues in the classroom? Many teachers still find that very difficult. Many want to avoid it, both personally and professionally. That's understandable because it's not something that a lot of people have done in their own education. And yet, it seems to me that that's central to how we deal with these issues. If teachers are avoiding the difficult issues, that is surely a message to children that it's okay to do that themselves. Can we really continue any work in the system without the capacity to deal with controversial issues? There has been some very good work done on this, particularly in recent years. The NGOs have done some work, NICE has done work and publications and so forth. Chris, particularly, one of the best sessions for my students in one of my final year modules is when Chris staff, David or Lisa, come in and deal with controversial issues and have a really interactive opportunity. SEA has published as well, so there is stuff out there. I think we need more, and we need to encourage teachers more in this one. And of course, reconciliation. What is our motivation for being involved in this work? Is it economic efficiency? That's important. Is it school improvement? That's important. Is it a shared society? That's certainly important. Is, for many, I suspect for many here, reconciliation would be a key word in how we define what we do. All of these are important. Reconciliation, I think, is particularly important. There have been a number of discussions and reports that have suggested that the understanding of the concept is a bit ambiguous. And a report in 2004, Hamber and Kelly, suggested 5 characteristics of reconciliation. And again, I throw these out to see if they're helpful. Developing a shared vision of an interdependent and fair society, acknowledging and dealing with the past, building positive relationships, significant cultural and attitudinal change, and substantial social, economic, and political change. I think quite a few of those are things that teachers who are wholeheartedly involved in this work, in whatever capacity, are trying to do. But again, I throw that out. So does that help us to see our agenda for where we go from here?